Tim wasn't able to make it, so I will be giving his presentation, and I don't know, does he have a Boston? He doesn't really have a Boston accent, so okay. So this is about the data citation implementation pilot, and really for driving sort of data publication and sort of the whole ecosystem around making data available. One of the key issues is providing appropriate credit, putting data in the same sort of ecosystem as publications are, and so the citation is sort of key to that. And having data citation sort of in the same game as regular publications, it also helps for other in other areas. So in terms of promoting better science with transparency, validation, being able to link between papers, the data, derived data, papers resulting from that, so that you end up with sort of a whole web of information as to what data led to what publications and how they relate to other data that might be out there. Also having the cited data supports better reuse and discovery. So when you're doing large meta-analyses, having a proper way to cite the data that you're pulling in to an analysis will allow others to better use that data. And also the whole issue of we talked a bit about sort of you have individual subjects, what George was showing, you have individual subjects in different data sets. So, how do you cite, within the data set itself, which is, I think, still an open question. And so the data citation pilot, really to drive data citation is technical, but it's also sociological. And so, there are a number of, areas of science policy and a number of initiatives that are being put forward both here in the U.S. and in Europe, from actual government agencies such as NIH, the Royal Society, but then there are other organizations such as CODATA, Force 11, RDA, that are all sort of working towards making data as primary and object as publications in the scientific sphere. And it also requires bringing together people who are involved with the technical infrastructure. So that's, on one end, the repositories, and on the other end, it's the publishers and their publishing workflows. So making sure that all these stakeholders sort of have what they need to go through and do this implementation. And how do we then actually also transform sort of the practice of data citation? So that's really engaging publishers and other entities, sort of engaging them so that they do actually come on board and support this. And so, as I mentioned early on, there's the whole web sort of credit for data. So when data is cited in a reference list, providing easy access to others to reuse this data, and so this doesn't look like the mouse that Lucilla had in her earlier slide, but it's the same idea, right? That you have this whole cycle of data use and reuse, coming off of the ability to properly reference the data. And the data citation implementation pilot builds off the joint declaration of data citation principles. I won't go through all of them, but there's a number of publishers and other organizations came together and agreed upon sort of 8 high-level statements about data citation. And these are the principles that the pilot is trying to uphold. And so, again, the data citation implementation pilot started in 2016. It is being coordinated through Force 11 to bring the groups together to work on this. And there are a number of different participants. So participants include, on the one end, the publishers. So we've had a good sort of relationship with bringing publishers on board and bringing publishers into the working groups to build support for this. And there are a number of publishers, including Elsevier, who have been starting to support the data citation principles in terms of updating their workflows to support a data citation. And the Elsevier one, I think the Elsevier announcement of their support across their journals came out right before the December BD2K all hands meeting is when they announced that. So we have publishers taking part of that. We have, on the other end, we have a number of repositories taking part, and then also the actual people involved in the infrastructure of maintaining the citations and sort of the identifiers for these citations, and that is California Digital Library and DataCite. So DataCite is the primary organization that generates DOIs for data sets. And so that's a large joint program with a number of different organizations who are looking at that. And the California Digital Library is one of the sort of leading institutions in terms of the DataCite project. And then Crossref, of course, is the group that manages, the nonprofit that manages sort of the DOI space in terms of publications and looking for interlinkages there. And so when we're talking about data citation itself, one of the key aspects is, well, what is the actual the format that journals should, what are the standards for data citation? So this was part of the initial work of the data citation work. Meeting with again, a number of workshops were held with the publishers, basically to come up with principles for the data citation. Here's a specific example of how data citation is being conceptualized by the publishers. So basically, looks very similar to a standard publication with the addition of some potentially additional identifier information. But again, this is something for, publishers need to have, a guided sort of a set standard to work with. I think I mentioned this already with the previous slide. Again, I'm walking through Tim's slides that I saw this morning, so apologize for any reduplication of what I've been talking about. But the main thing was the sort of the deliverables that came out. So again, there are a number of different working groups that were targeted at different constituencies. So there was a publishers working group, that got the publishers together to really focus on, what do we need to do to implement this on our side? And again, for a publisher to implement, new citation standards, that requires updating, modifying, changing their workflow, their business workflow, which means actually updating, a whole host of, legacy and other software that is used to run their editorial process. So again, it's not, a simple thing for a lot of these, publishers to just, do something new, right? It's a really deep process for them to go in and change their workflow. Martin Fenner from DataCite, was one of the people involved in working with repositories. So they just had a workshop, sort of part of the course here at the Force 11 Summer Institute, where they really brought together repositories and what needs to happen on a repository landing page to support data citation. So when you go to, just like when you go to a publisher's page on a journal article, where you can sort of, with your, reference manager software, EndNote, for example, you can pull and extract, the citation right from that page, right? The appropriate metadata is there. Everything's there for you to extract the citation. Same thing has to happen at repositories now, right? Because repositories become, in a sense, the journal's for the data. And so that's one of the things that was held here at the Summer Institute. As I mentioned, the publishers. There are a number of papers that are also already in preprint archives. So again, the repositories roadmap. There's something in bioRxiv that's already there. For the publishers roadmap, they've also released something to bioRxiv, and there are 5 publishers. So Elsevier was one of the first, but there are now 5 publishers that are now committed to implement the recommendations from this. There's also then work on, well, how do we actually then identify data sets? Because not all repositories use DOIs. So a typical thing in databases is to use a session number. So that's the short, the sort of a repository-specific identifier with a namespace declaration that I am a GenBank record. But the issue there was no global infrastructure to do the lookup and redirection of those identifiers. And so one of the things that this pilot brought together was both the EBI, who had developed identifiers.org, and the California Digital Library that maintains a resolution service by themselves. And they've signed a memorandum of understanding to basically implement these global resolution services, and they're sharing information on these compact identifier namespaces, so that if we have a reference to a repository and an identifier in the paper, that we do have just like you have dx.doi.org that resolves DOI for you. Now you can go to EBI CDL to do a resolution of one of these compact identifiers. And there's currently work going on with Chris Mungle and Julie McMurray in terms of actually developing sort of a prefix commons, in the sense of, for the repositories that BioCaddy is indexing, what is, this compact notation for, the ones, that we currently have. There's also then a whole working group that was dedicated to creating sort of tutorial guidance facts, around these. And so those are, there's a data citation facts for publishers that's now online. So again, there's, a whole host of these working groups targeting sort of different areas, of this issue, to make sure that there is sort of an end-to-end solution for, data citation itself. There's also a number of the publications I think they have been or will be submitted to Nature Scientific Data. So there are plans not just for preprint versions of these, but also to have these submitted as full papers. And so these are the data citation roadmap for scientific publishers is, as I mentioned, is out. There's the citation roadmap for the data repositories. So these are sort of, again, the bookends of what's needed for data citation. And then there's also the bioRxiv paper on the uniform resolution of compact identifiers. And so again, these are all out. But what this is leading to is, there have been other groups now looking at data authorship as incentives to data sharing. So a number of members from this pilot took part in, I forget if it's a workshop or a specific working group from the New England Journal of Medicine, where looking to, looking at issues like how does one strengthen institutional incentives, to share data. And again, authorship citation is one of the keys. And so again, I think this pilot has had a lot of far-reaching sort of impacts, at the publishers, in terms of adopting, sort of data citation in a standard way, providing, ability for, California Digital Library, the EU through the EBI to come together to support, sort of global resolution, of these compact identifiers, and then also, putting together, some of the work groups, for the repositories too, in terms of, how does one, deal with, one's new landing page in this. And there also has been work, point out, so this is, acknowledgments of various people that have been involved in the work. So from the publishers, from the repositories. I mentioned California Digital Library, EBI, and Elixir. But the other thing is, which there wasn't a slide on, is that there's also been an interaction with Google, Natasha Noy and Dan Brickley, also in the areas of schema.org. So this is sort of a cooperative. I mean, it's complementary to what Philippe mentioned earlier, and this is really about what is needed in schema.org for representing data citations. And so there are a couple things that schema.org needs in terms of extensions, in terms of handling citations. Because with data, you have different types of citations. You have a sort of a primary citation, for example, which is potentially the publication that resulted in the creation of the data. But then you have other citations that are around, the analysis of the data. So, that wasn't, for example, is not something that is clear to notate in schema.org. And so that was, one of the, potential extensions. But that's work that's still sort of, being discussed with them. So I think that is the end of Tim's presentation, so hopefully I did it justice. And so any questions?